All right. So like I said, we're going to break up the digestive system into 2 lectures, which is quite a feat. There's so much information, but I think what I've done is we're covering all the material in as a direct way as possible with not much fluff involved to kind of get through it, making sure you guys get the full information that I want to convey to you. All right. So when we talk, hold on a second, let me see, here we go. So when we talk about the digestive system, just like any system, we talk about functions, right? We know about the nervous systems involved in communication, right? Afferent, efferent. We spoke about the respiratory system involved, obviously, in bringing in oxygen, delivering oxygen into the circulation, cleaning air, right? Conditioning it so it'll be clean for distribution to the body, all sorts of things like that, structure, function, relationships. Well, now let's take a look at the digestive system. And first and foremost, as you might expect, its role is digestion. Well, the food that we eat is not in a form that we can utilize it. Whether you know, the steak you eat or the soy burger or whatever, what we're eating is not readily available to our bodies. So we have to break it down. What's it say? That shouldn't say too small. Oops, hold on a second. That should say basically too large for the blood. Let me back up. Sorry about that. It should say too large for the blood. All right, there we go. Yeah, so it's too large to be absorbed into the circulation. So we have to break down these large molecules, break down the bonds into simple forms, things like amino acids, glucose, fatty acids, things like that. So that's the whole idea of digestion, taking a large substance like food, which has all these nutrients in it, but we can't get to them. So we have to break it down so they're available. The way we do that is by a couple different ways. One is through secretion of a variety of different substances we'll look at in the lecture. A lot of enzymes. We refer to enzymes as an exocrine type production, meaning that it's squirted into the digestive tract to help to break down food. Enzymes and mucus. We'll talk about the role of mucus. Mucus is one of those things we've already heard about with the respiratory system, involved in cleaning, trapping, but in digestive system, it has a much different function. So we have secretion. Hello, question? Oh. So secretion of enzymes and other types of molecules. Also, we have an endocrine secretion, which involves the production of specific hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers. You guys already heard about them. These are chemical messengers that are squirted into the blood that play a role in digestion as well. We'll learn about some of those hormones today, and we'll also learn about some of
It's so fun. I'm playing videos on YouTube of like people what they were doing at the Zoom sessions, you know, because you can have your own camera and stuff. Yeah. But like kids that started like smoking tapes.
Hello?
And the teacher's like, "What are you doing?"
Mute the class, Dr. Crown.
He's not in the class?
No, you just need to mute the entire class, I think.
Yeah, that's what I'll have to do. As much as I don't want to, I'll just have to mute it. Sorry, guys. Hold on a second. Mute all. There we go. All right. Okay. Okay. All right. And if you guys have any questions, you know, feel free to send me questions through the chat. I may not get to them during lecture, but I will get to them sometime and I'll give you my response to that. So we have secretion. We also have motility. Motility is movement. The reason why food goes from our oral cavity all the way down through our esophagus, stomach, and beyond, it has to do with muscle movement, muscle contractions. Those muscle contractions help in moving food from one compartment to the other, but in the process, that movement also helps to mechanically break down the food. All right, so we really have two things that are helping out with digesting food. Number one, we have secretions, which act on the food directly to break it down. And then we have movement, which helps to sort of mechanically chop it up. There's two types of motility we'll talk about in a little bit. One is called segmentation. This is the mixing of food that occurs primarily in the stomach and the small intestine, but it can occur other places as well. That's the mixing. And the peristalsis has to do with the pushing of food into like the next compartment. So we have two of these types of motility that are dependent on muscle. Once the food is sufficiently acted upon and broken down to its basic constituents, we need to salvage those nutrients. So the nutrients are then absorbed into the circulation. This primarily occurs in the small intestine. Small intestine, of all the different organs that we'll talk about, then they're all important. The small intestine plays, I'd say, the most significant role in absorbing nutrients into the circulation. That's why people who have intestinal disorders, whether it's celiac disease, especially, or others, it can actually have really serious consequences in terms of malabsorption, nutrient deficiency. So that's where most of the absorption takes place, and it goes into the circulation. Not everything we eat is nutritious or available to us, or do we absorb. What we don't absorb is wasted, and that basically is stored and eliminated through the large intestine and then eventually out through the anus. All right, so those are the 5 different components, and you can pretty much look at secretion and motility as really part of the digestive process. All right. So if you take a look, this kind of summarizes several different things. Number one, you can actually see the different organs: the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, and so on. You can see the description of the different functions. We talk about food being digested by way of motility or movement, as well as secretions. And of course, ultimately, you can follow the arrow. Once food reaches the small intestine, it's broken down and it's absorbed into the circulation, where it travels through all the different organs and supplying nutrients for growth and repair to all the different organs. Growth, energy, and repair. What is not absorbed is eventually eliminated. That's the storage and then the elimination. You can see the digestive tract is really a tube. One long tube. Now, granted, it's a convoluted tube, but it's not really essentially any different than if you think of the digestive tract of an earthworm, except with an earthworm, there's we have a single opening and a single, well, actually one opening at the front, one opening in the back, which is what we do. But obviously with an earthworm, it's very simple. Here we've got a lot of different activities going throughout. But the similarities is that we have this input, all this digestion occurring, and then the output. Oops. Wow, I really jumped ahead. How'd that happen? Okay, here we go. Okay. So let's take a look now at the digestive system itself and look at all the organs involved. We can divide the gastrointestinal system or the digestive system into 2 parts. What we call the tract, which is that tube that I just showed you earlier. It varies from individual to individual. It's about 15 feet long. And it begins with the mouth, obviously, through the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, colon, which is another name. These two are really another name for the large intestine. And then finally, the anus. That's the tract, that's the tube, and that's where food is traveling through. Well, in addition, we also have structures called accessory glands or accessory organs. These are structures that contribute to digestion, but aren't essentially part of the tract. So for example, the salivary glands, they're up here, they're actually outside the oral cavity, but they squirt substances like saliva into the oral cavity. We have the gallbladder and liver. Gallbladder and liver are not part of the tract, but through a series of ducts, they squirt bile and other substances into the digestive tract. Pancreas, same thing. Here's the pancreas, squirts material. So these are organs that are not part of that tube, but they're connected to it. And they even throw in the teeth and the tongue, which is interesting because they are in the oral cavity, but again, they have other contributing factors such as mechanical breakdown of food. So we have the digestive or the GI tract and the accessory glands. Now, through anatomy and even here in physiology as well, we've learned a lot about histology. Most recently, we looked at the histology of the respiratory tract. And that's actually another good example of a tract, right? That's a tube, right? We've got the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli, right? And we had distinct layers. We spoke about the circulatory system with the blood vessels. Remember the tunica media, interna, and externa, we had layers. Digestive tract also has layers. It's a tube. But the layers here actually consists of 4 distinct components. This is the lumen. This is where food's traveling through. The layer that immediately surrounds the lumen is called the mucosa. You may have also heard it known as the mucous membrane. This is in contact with the food. And we'll talk a little bit about the functions and really the breakdown or the composition of the mucosa. Outside the mucosa, we have what's called the submucosa. And this is a layer of connective tissue, which also has blood vessels and nerves that we'll learn a lot about that help with digestion. Outside of that, we have what's called the muscularis externa. Here it just calls it muscularis, but it's the muscularis externa. And in every region of the digestive tract, except for the muscle, there are 2 layers. We have what's known as the circular layer, and you can see why it's called circular. And we have the longitudinal layer. These are the layers of the muscularis that are important for motility, segmentation, and peristalsis. The stomach actually has a 3rd layer that is not shown here outside called the oblique layer. And that makes sense because the stomach, more than any other organ, the stomach is where most of the motility occurs. A lot of mixing, a lot of mechanical movement to help to break up food. Outside of the muscularis externa, we have the serosa, which is otherwise known as the serous membrane. You know, we've spoken a lot about the pleural membrane for the lungs. We've spoken about the pericardial membrane that surrounds the heart. This right here, the serous membrane, is what surrounds the digestive tract, and it's primarily connective tissue. All right, so to kind of summarize a little bit and go into kind of a little bit more detail, this is an example of the digestive tract here. You can see what I've highlighted. Here's the mucosa. Here is the submucosa. Here is the muscularis externa, the 2 layers. And here is the serosa. Now, you'll notice with each layer, there are parts to it. As we'll learn, within the mucosa, we have three different regions, what's called the epithelium, which is at the surface, what we call the lamina propria, and then we have what's called the muscularis mucosa, which we'll talk about. So they make up the mucosa. The submucosa is characterized by having a lot of blood vessels and a nervous collection of neurons that we'll talk about shortly that make up what's known as the enteric nervous system, which is something we haven't spoken about yet, but you'll find it, I think, very fascinating. Then we have the muscularis layer, which of course is the circular layer, inner circular, outer longitudinal, and then we have another part of an enteric nervous system. And then we have the serosa. All right. All right, so let's start with the mucosa. As I mentioned, the mucosa, or mucous membrane, it separates the lumen, this is the lumen, from this area right here, this what we call this environment, these cells. There are three layers of the mucosa: the epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. And that's what we're looking at here, the epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. So why do we have three layers? Or what is their makeup? The epithelium, of course, you guys know what epithelium is, right? We spoke about cuboidal, columnar, PSCC. The function of the epithelium here is to secrete and absorb. So secrete enzymes to help to break down food, and also to absorb those nutrients when they're sufficiently broken down. That's couple important parts. The third part is the fact that the epithelium is folded. And I don't know if you can tell here, maybe if I go back to this previous, you can see how it's folded. It's not straight. This has to do, and this creates a very large surface area. And we've spoken a lot about surface area, right? With the branching of all the blood vessels into the arterioles and the capillaries, more blood vessels, more surface area increases the rate of gas exchange. We spoke about the branching of the respiratory tract, the bronchi, the bronchioles, or all that branching greatly increases the efficiency. In this case, the increased folding increases the surface area to maximize the area for secretion and absorption. So virtually every system, most of the internal systems have a structure that maximizes the surface area in a variety of ways, whether it's branching or whether it's folding, to maximize their function. Underneath that epithelia, we have the lamina propria, which is connective tissue, which has some blood vessels. And the third is the muscularis mucosa, which, and if you think of muscularis, that sounds like muscle. In fact, it's a very thin, almost like a rubber band layer of muscle. Now, we've already spoken about the muscularis externa, which is way out here, right? And that's involved in peristalsis and segmentation, moving food through the tract. The muscularis mucosa, it has more of a local effect in kind of helping to break down food locally to kind of maximize the absorption. All right. So with the cell, let's talk about the cell types of the epithelium. There's three main types of epithelial cells. What we call absorptive cells. These are cells that, as the name implies, are going to absorb the digested nutrients. Exocrine cells, these are cells that are going to secrete enzymes out into the lumen, as well as produce mucus, things like that. So it's kind of a two-way, right? Absorption this way, exocrine this way. And then we have endocrine cells. These are hormone-producing cells that secrete hormones into the blood, which eventually will have effects locally. And we'll talk a little bit later about what are the different hormones that are involved. All right, so this is the mucous membrane. Now, in the epithelium, a little bit more about the lamina propria. So as I mentioned, the lamina propria is connective tissue. Within that connective tissue, we have a lot of vessels, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. And as you guys know, this is typical with most connective tissue, right? Most connective tissue have blood vessels and nerves because there really aren't any blood vessels in the epithelium. This is how the cells get their nourishment, things like that. So a lot of blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves, and interestingly, we also have a lot of lymphocytes, lymphoid tissue through the digestive tract. They're known as lymph nodules, and they're known as Peyer's patches in the small intestine, named after Professor Peyer. You might wonder, it's like, well, this is odd. I thought lymphocytes were in the blood. Well, it's true they are, but we also have lymphocytes scattered in different parts of the body where there's access to the outside world. So for example, food and things like that, right, coming from the outside, your digestive tract is really exposed to the outside through the oral cavity. So this lymphoid tissue is an important way, an additional component of the immune system that helps to sort of, help to protect us as well. The muscularis mucosa, again, it's very thin, like a rubber band, has a couple different layers of fibers, and its functions is in mixing, local mixing of things, whereas the muscularis externa has more of a role in pushing things into the next compartment, kind of more of a mass scale, large scale mixing and propulsion of food. This is more of a local effect. All right, moving from the mucosa into the submucosa. So the submucosa is down this area, not the best picture, but it is what it is. The submucosa is a very thick layer of connective tissue. It has some collagen fibers. It has a lot of elastic fibers. And this is what allows the digestive tract to do all this movement. If you think of food coming through, the muscles are acting, right? Mixing and pushing food through. As they're doing their actions, right, that has an effect on the wall of the digestive tract. If we didn't have elastic tissue, the digestive tract wouldn't go back to its original shape after it's churned and everything. So this allows the muscle the digestive tract to return back to its original shape after all the contents of food are mixed. So there's a lot of fibers here. Much like the lamina propria, more blood vessels, more lymphatic vessels, and a lot more nerves. Now, in this particular case, the nerves that we have are very specialized. It's known as the submucosal plexus. This is a collection of nerves. It's also known as Meissner's plexus, and you'll see either in books. This is the way it was always called, and now unfortunately they're getting rid of a lot of the names of the people that discovered them, which I think is kind of rather unfortunate. Instead of like in the kidney with Bowman's capsule, now they're just calling it the glomerular capsule. But anyway, so this is a collection of neurons that are part of what's called the enteric nervous system. So we haven't spoken about that. In a few slides forward, I'm going to go expand a bit more, but suffice it to say, it's sometimes referred to as the second brain. And I'm not just making that up. This is very well documented. There's a lot of research being going on right now. And the reason why it's called the second brain is because if you think of what our brain does, our brain controls a lot of aspects of our being, right? Muscle contraction, a lot of the role of our organs, right? The enteric nervous system, basically its function is to control the digestive tract. So the digestive tract could function without the brain. The enteric nervous system is kind of the brain that takes care of that. Having said that, however, the autonomic system, as you know, of course, can influence it, much like the heart, right? Remember, the heart can contract on its own because it's got the myogenic, the conducting system, but the sympathetic and parasympathetic can adjust it. Same thing is true here. The enteric nervous system kind of rules the roost, but the input from the autonomic and the parasympathetic neurons, which you don't see here, can also influence the digestive tract. All right. Moving to the muscularis externa. So one of the interesting things is that, well, like I mentioned before, there are typically two layers, an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer. The circular kind of adjusts by mixing, adjusts the diameter. The outer longitudinal kind of changes the length. Kind of, you think of like a slinky toy, kind of helps to push food along. In the stomach, there's a third layer called the oblique layer. These are the layers that are involved in both peristalsis, which is the pushing of food to the next compartment, and the segmentation. I like to think of segmentation as kind of like tossing salad, or even like how a washing machine works, right? That type of movement. Now, you notice up here, I put skeletal or smooth, and this is interesting. So we think of the gut as kind of, as working on its own, right? But depending on where you are in the gut or the digestive tract determines what type of muscle you have. For example, in the oral cavity and in the upper part of the esophagus, we have skeletal muscle. If you think of swallowing, right? Swallowing, at least the initial part of it, is a voluntary action, right? So we have skeletal muscle. As we go further down the esophagus into the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, the muscle is smooth. It reverts back to skeletal once again when we get into the anal canal and the anus. The process of defecation, going to the bathroom, involves kind of the voluntary decision to go, right? I mean, obviously there's pressure, but the voluntary decision to go is dependent on skeletal. So basically we have skeletal muscle at both ends, in the oral cavity and the esophagus, and down at the anal canal. We also have another layer that make up the enteric nervous system, which is called the myenteric or Auerbach's plexus. So these are these clusters of neurons. We'll spend a little time on enteric because for me, it's probably one of the most fascinating things. I really enjoy the enteric nervous system. All right, what about the serosa? The serosa is the outer part, which is what we're looking at right here. So there's the muscularis, there's the submucosa, right? There's the mucosa. The serosa consists of an outer layer, inner layer of connective tissue, an outer layer of epithelium. Basically, it's part of what we call the peritoneum, which is very similar. We talk about the peritoneum is not much different, pretty much the same as when we talk about the pleural membranes that surround the lungs, the pericardium that surrounds the heart. We've got the peritoneum that wraps around the most of the digestive organs. All right. So as promised, I mentioned that I was going to talk about the enteric nervous system. And the enteric nervous system, like I mentioned, is also known as the second brain. It is influenced by the ANS, but it's also autonomous. What does that mean? That's kind of seems like a oxymoron. Well, it can function on its own, but it takes input from the sympathetic and parasympathetic. What does the enteric nervous system do? Everything that needs to be done for digestion. Regulating peristalsis or motility, regulates the blood flow into the gut, and also regulates the secretions, right, that are from the epithelium, all those exocrine and endocrine secretions. This is kind of something I thought was kind of funny. I found this cartoon. Here's the intestine, here's the brain, and it's like gutsy move for a brain. Little humor there. Or at least my attempt at it. So this is interesting too. You guys have heard of the gut-brain connection, right? And what's interesting is that it's been found that it's very well documented that the gut and the brain are in really strong contact with each other. And many more signals, nerves, go from the gut to the brain than from the brain to the gut. And this explains a lot, like say if you're having some sort of gastric or intestinal upset, mentally you feel lousy, right? So there's a very strong communication between essentially the two brains, right? The gut and the brain and the brain itself. All right. So these are just some diagrams I showed you. This is an embryo. What you're looking at, this fluorescent labeling, this is the nervous system. And you can see that here's the brain. It's all lit up. Here's the spinal cord. Here's some other peripheral nerves. But look at this extensive nerve pathway. This is all within the gut, all throughout the gut. Very well developed. This diagram right here, let's see if I can move this up a bit. Let's see. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. This is showing these intrinsic neurons. These are all part of the, this is the, could be Meissner's or Auerbach's plexus, and this is showing input from the parasympathetic or sympathetic pathways, right? So they both provide input to this system itself to regulate it. There's a lot of interesting studies that have been done on this, showing the effects of certain types of psychotropic drugs, such as antidepressants, and how they can, some of the side effects are digestive upset, right? Constipation. And one of the reasons for this, it's believed, is because a lot of those psychotropic drugs act on serotonin. Well, we know there's serotonin in the brain, but there's a lot more serotonin that's produced by neurons in the gut. And these drugs, with no doubt, influence the activity of serotonin, which is actually known to stimulate gut motility. So definitely plays a role there as a side effect. All right. So what I want to do right now is, now that we've gone through all the layers, now I want to go through each of the different organs. We're going to get probably through the stomach today. And then on Thursday, we'll finish up with these three and then get into the accessory organs. So let's take a journey through the digestive tract, and we'll start with the mouth. So first of all, one of the things to look at with each organ is, what is it about that organ that contributes to its role in the digestive system? What enables it to carry out its function? Excuse me. Well, in the oral cavity, we really have three things that participate in digestion. The tongue, and you might think, how does the tongue play a role, right? Well, the tongue, obviously the tongue has many important roles. It plays a role in speech, right? They have taste buds, but though that per se is not a role in digestion. It might influence what we do eat, but it doesn't have a role in digestion. The role in digestion has to do with actually the movement of the tongue. The tongue acts as a mechanical structure, for lack of a more technical term, that slaps food up against the palate, that helps to mechanically break it down. Same thing is true with the teeth, right? I'm not going to get into all the details of the teeth here. We do that more in anatomy, but suffice it to say, as you already know, the food actually helps to mechanically break down food. So we're really going to be looking at two different forms of digestion in the oral cavity. One is the mechanical, which is the tongue and the teeth. And the second is chemical. And that's where the salivary glands play a role. Okay. So what takes place in the oral cavity? First of all, we bring food into the oral cavity and we chew it. That's another name. That's mastication. That's chewing. During mastication, obviously, we got the tongue and the teeth chopping stuff, slapping it around, and then we've got the saliva that's squirting out from the different salivary glands into the oral cavity. So what is it about saliva that makes it that play a role in digestion? First of all, it contains an enzyme known as amylase. Amylase is an enzyme that plays a role in digesting starch. And starch is a complex carbohydrate that you find in breads and rice and stuff like that, that gets broken down to a simpler form of sugar. And you can actually do a little experiment with yourself. If you take a piece of bread, put it in your mouth, instead of swallowing it right away, hold it in your mouth, not for hours, maybe a couple minutes, and you'll notice that the bread starts to taste sweet. Now, I don't mean using King's Hawaiian bread or anything like that, just regular bread. It'll start to taste sweet, and that's the action of the amylase. Saliva also lubricates food, especially if you're eating anything very abrasive like tortilla chips or something like that, that can damage the esophagus going down. This helps to lubricate it. And finally, on an interesting note, the saliva contains an antibacterial enzymes that help to kill some bacteria. And that makes sense, right? How can bacteria get into our body? Well, one route is right through here. So if we can kind of nip it in the bud, kill off some bacteria up here, and then maybe those lymph nodules down the digestive tract can take care of the rest, you know, that's good. It's not a perfect system, but at least it can kill some bacteria. Now, what's interesting about that is those of you guys that have dogs or cats, many times they'll injure their paw and they'll lick it. Well, they also have antibacterial enzymes, and by licking their wounds, that can help heal it. But for obvious reasons, maybe just how it appears in public, but also it's not good to do, I would strongly discourage you from licking your own wounds, right? Because the bacteria and the antibacterial stuff, the enzyme that we have in our mouth, it's not the most effective way for destroying bacteria that you get in a wound. It might kill bacteria that's maybe naturally enters into our oral cavity, but definitely you don't want to do that. So what also occurs in our mouth and beyond? Well, this is where swallowing occurs, right? So first we chew, we mix, and then we swallow. And the medulla oblongata, that nice part of the brain stem, is involved in coordinating this process. All right. So before we get to that, I just wanted to give you a picture showing where that we have three different salivary glands. We have what's known as the sublingual gland, which is located, as you might expect, under the tongue. We have the submandibular gland. There's the mandible. And then we have the parotid gland, which is located just in front of the ear, largest of the salivary glands. And they are all connected to the oral cavity by these tubes or ducts. All right. So from the oral cavity, food that goes, as we swallow it, it goes into the esophagus. And we'll talk about the deglutition or the swallowing process shortly. The pharynx is also known as the throat. It's the common passageway for air because the pharynx is also connected to the nose as well as the oral cavity. So there's the pharynx. From the pharynx, oral cavity, pharynx, food then next enters into the esophagus. But during this process is deglutition. So what's deglutition? What are the steps of deglutition? And we have voluntary and then involuntary. The voluntary part is what's called the buccal phase. Remember, those of you in anatomy, remember the buccinator muscle in the cheek? This involves essentially the formation of a bolus of food. What is a bolus of food? That's where the food is mixed with saliva, chopped up a bit by your teeth and tongue. It becomes like a little softball, very soft ball, right? And that's starting to move back to the back of the mouth. That's called the buccal phase. The next phase, which I think is well, they're all important, but the second phase, a couple of very crucial events occur. It's called the pharyngeal phase. And as food is pushed from the oral cavity back to the pharynx, there's a couple different routes that food can take. Food can go down the esophagus where we want it to go. Hold on a second, let me just adjust something here. Food can also go down the larynx, which is connected to the trachea where we don't want it to go. And food can also go into your nose. If anyone's ever had that experience with laughing and milk coming out your nose or whatever, there is a connection there. So those are three routes. Well, we don't want that to happen. So what typically happens during the pharyngeal phase is the uvula, which is this little flap. I'll show you another picture of it, which is that little punching bag, an extension of the soft palate. That deflects upward. That closes the entrance into the nose. So food can't go up your nose, or it shouldn't go up your nose when that's working properly. The other thing that happens is there's this other structure right here called the epiglottis, which is made up of elastic cartilage, and that folds over the entrance into the larynx. See, there's the larynx. This folds over. Now food can't go down there, but it goes down the esophagus. So now think of it as like a train track where you have all the switches that can direct the train which way to go. That's what's happening here. Now, when someone chokes, again, that could be because they ate too fast or whatever, but what happens, food somehow sneaks around and goes down the larynx into the trachea. The glottis is just the opening to the larynx. All right, last phase is the esophageal phase. Let me move this back up here. There we go. Is the esophageal phase. This is also involuntary. Once food has gotten into the esophagus, there's a couple of things that have to happen. Remember I mentioned that food goes from one compartment to the next by way of the muscles? Well, there's another set of muscles called sphincters. These are valves. And to get into the esophagus, there's what's called the upper esophageal sphincter, commonly known as the UES. Once food opens up, or once the sphincter opens up, food gets into the esophagus, that upper sphincter closes, and then the lower one opens up to let food into the stomach. And we'll talk a little bit about a pathology known as gastroesophageal reflux disease, which is due to a defect in the lower sphincter. All right, so a little bit more about the esophagus. So it's a muscular tube. No actual digestion occurs here, right? There's digestion, right? Mechanical and chemical digestion that occurs in the mouth. And as we'll see in the stomach and beyond there is, but this is essentially a tube that connects the pharynx to the stomach. Very important tube, however. It's very muscular. There's the peristalsis that occurs that helps to push it down. This is where we start to see a transition of muscle. So in the upper part of the esophagus, as well as in the oral cavity, we have skeletal muscle, the upper third essentially. And this is true even with the upper esophageal sphincter. This is all skeletal muscle. As we transition further down, it becomes smooth muscle. So upper esophageal, the upper third is skeletal muscle, the lower 2/3 is smooth muscle. And that includes the lower esophageal sphincter. All right. So it's interesting, what isn't shown here, but you know it's there, is something called the diaphragm, right? The diaphragm, remember, is at the bottom of the lungs, and when it contracts, right, it flattens out, which helps to bring air in by increasing the volume. Well, here's the stomach. How the heck does the esophagus get through here? Well, there happens to be a little hole in this diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus. There also happens to be an opening for the aorta and the vena cava as well. But this is called, you don't see it here, it's a hiatus, and that allows the esophagus to pass through. People who have what's called a hiatal hernia, that involves the stomach pushing up through that little hole, which constricts it, which causes a variety of problems. All right. Speaking of problems, there is an issue that more people have than we realize. And this is called gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD, GERD. Some people call it reflux. Some people also call it heartburn. This is due to a defective lower esophageal sphincter. Now, what's supposed to happen, I'm going to show you a video here. What is supposed to happen is that as food goes down, this is meant to be a bolus of food, goes down through the esophagus into the stomach. This sphincter opens up, and then once the food is through, this sphincter, which just looks like regular muscle, closes to prevent any backflow, right? Well, unfortunately, with GERD, that doesn't close properly, so you get the splashing back. So I'm going to show you a video, and let me just make sure it's working okay. Let's see. Let me just go. Hold on 1 second. Let me just hold on 1 second here. Let's see. Stop share. Okay. Share screen. Okay. Here we go. And let's see. And volume. Let's make sure volume is up. It's a really cool video, I think.
When you swallow food, it travels through a tube called the esophagus. The esophagus leads into the stomach through a hole in a sheet of muscle called the diaphragm. There's a round muscle at the bottom of the esophagus that works like a valve. The muscle relaxes when you swallow, allowing food to pass into the stomach. Certain cells in your stomach, called proton pumps, release acid to help digest the food. The lining of your stomach protects it from the acid. The esophagus has a different type of lining, which looks like it's made of smooth tile. The valve is designed to close tightly after you swallow, so nothing comes back into the esophagus. Your diaphragm is also meant to pinch securely around the esophagus, closing off the opening to your stomach. It's normal for a small amount of acid to occasionally splash into the esophagus. This is called reflux. That word means flowing back. A small amount of reflux doesn't usually cause any harm. But if acid splashes up into the esophagus over and over again for years, the esophagus can be damaged. There are several reasons this might happen. It's not uncommon for the valve to become weaker, so it doesn't close tightly. That allows acid and partially digested food to come up into the esophagus. Sometimes the diaphragm weakens around the esophagus, allowing the hole to become larger. This hole is called the hiatus. When it becomes larger, part of the stomach may bulge through it. This is called a hiatal hernia. The hernia may cause the esophagus and the valve to move up. In that case, the diaphragm is no longer reinforcing the valve. That makes it more likely that acid will get into the esophagus. When acid and food splash up into the esophagus repeatedly, it's called gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. Gastro for the stomach, or gastric system. Esophageal for the esophagus. Mayo Clinic's Division of Gastroenterology and Hepatology is recognized as #1 by U.S. News and...
All right. We don't need this. That's a little...
A lot of guys
Oops.
wonder when
Hold
a
on.
girl pulls away, puts you in the frame.
What the heck is
Do
this?
I
All right, let me go back here. It's amazing all these things that happen. All right, so let's go back. Let's see. So anyway, so that's a nice description of GERD, or esophageal reflux. All right, let me go back to where we were. Here we are. All right. All right, so that's a nice little description of what we call GERD. And so hopefully you kind of have an understanding of that. More people have it than they realize. And it's can be a problem later on. It actually, not to scare anybody, but repeated reflux with the acid continually splashing on the esophagus can lead to a precancerous condition. And so I definitely wouldn't ignore if you have a lot of this reflux going on. Fortunately, there's a lot of treatments for it, medications. And sometimes it just involves reducing your food intake or watching what type of food you eat. All right, moving along here. All right, so let's get to the stomach. And the stomach is the part of the digestive tract that we're going to stop at today. Lot to say about the stomach. It's the most distensible part of the digestive tract, meaning it stretches out to the greatest degree. A lot of mixing going on here. It's a huge mixing vat. And of course, so it receives food from the esophagus and then empties food into the intestine, but very, very slowly. What first happens when food comes into the stomach is that it's stored. So it doesn't automatically from the esophagus to the stomach to the intestine. That would not be a good thing. And one of the reasons for that is if food goes into the intestine as quickly as it comes into the stomach right away, whatever you're eating, whether it's a high sugar amount or whatever your diet, you're going to get a surge of blood sugar that's going to potentially lead to issues later on. Now, granted, yes, people have diabetes, people have high blood sugar, but by stalling the food so we don't get the surge going into the intestine and being absorbed at once, it helps to regulate it more effectively. So it's stored. Normally, an empty stomach is roughly about 50 mils. A full stomach can basically contain about 1 liter. And when I say empty, it's not really empty. There's always a little bit in there. So it can hold up to 1 liter per quart. Digestive-wise, what's the main function of the stomach? Protein digestion. Remember the oral cavity, it's starch digestion, right? Amylase. In the stomach, it's protein digestion. There's an enzyme called pepsin that we'll be talking about shortly. That is the enzyme responsible for at least initiating the breakdown of proteins. Here's this bacteria word again. Remember in the oral cavity, I mentioned that we have this enzyme, antibacterial enzyme that can kill some bacteria. Well, the stomach is also an environment that is not very hospitable to bacteria. It's very acidic. And we'll talk about why shortly. But one of the things is that it's not a perfect system. And in fact, there are some bacteria that thrive in this pH of 2 environment. You guys may have heard of H. pylori. We'll talk about that shortly and understand why it's able to thrive. By the time food passes through the stomach, it's now kind of in a semi-solid, more liquefied state called chyme. So think of the herb thyme, T-H-Y-M, and just call it chyme. All right. So this is a nice view of the stomach, and we're going to do a little bit of anatomy. First of all, the stomach is divided up into 4 regions. This part that is just adjacent to the esophagus is called the cardia, stomach. This part that kind of protrudes upward is called the fundus or fundic stomach. The remainder is known as the body. And then the last part, prior to entering into the small intestine, is known as the pylorus. And you notice there's another sphincter there too. Remember, going into a different compartment, this is called the pyloric sphincter. Now, why do we have these different names? Well, there are some functional differences with these regions. I'm not going to get into them too much. A lot of it has to do with maybe the proportions of different cell types. One area might produce more mucus, one area might produce more enzyme, but I'm not going to get into that. The main thing is just know those 4 regions. What else can we say about the stomach? The stomach is made up, remember that muscularis is now 3 layers. We have the longitudinal layer, the circular layer, and here's this oblique layer, which is not really a complete layer. It's these strands of oblique or range muscle, which allows the muscle to distend in different directions, right? Between the circular, longitudinal, and oblique. What also allows the muscle to distend are the presence of these folds. These are called rugae or ruga. These are fold. Think of an accordion, right? When someone's not playing the accordion, you have those folds that are pretty compact. When they start playing, it kind of stretches out. That's what that with these rugae. This is, in other words, an empty stomach. When the stomach is fully stretched out, you wouldn't be able to see these rugae. All right, so some extensive details here about the stomach. This is where we kind of get into a lot of the meat and potatoes of digestion. The anatomy of the stomach is such that we have the epithelium. So first, let's talk about kind of the general histology. Yes, we've got the same mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. Same thing. The uniqueness of the muscle is that the epithelia are arranged in these folds called gastric pits, and I'll show you some pictures of them. Instead of going straight across, you can see they kind of invaginate, right? Now, I'm using a comparison. It's probably not the best one, but remember when we're talking about the skeletal muscle with T-tubules, remember you have the plasma membrane and then the T-tubules. Obviously, that has nothing to do with this, but just think of that kind of like an invagination coming into the layer. So we have these gastric pits that eventually lead to this area, which are known as the gastric glands. This whole thing is a gastric gland. Within the gastric glands, we have very specialized cells. First of all, we have what are called chief cells. These cells are responsible for producing the precursor enzyme called pepsinogen. It's a precursor because it's not an active enzyme. In order for the enzyme to be activated, pepsinogen is converted into pepsin. And this only happens when there's food in the stomach. We don't want pepsinogen to be converted into pepsin when the stomach is empty, because then it would digest the stomach itself. So this is kind of a protective measure to ensure that we have this inactive enzyme that stays inactive until it's converted into pepsin when food's there. And the function of this enzyme is to break down those proteins. Remember, protein digestion takes place in the stomach. The second cell is known as the parietal cell, and this produces two main substances. It produces hydrochloric acid in a very unique way that we'll talk about, which helps to maintain a pH of 2, which can kill many bacteria, and also provides the optimal environment for pepsin to work. All enzymes need an optimal pH. Amylase, the optimal pH is about 7, which is what the oral cavity pH normally is. The stomach pH is 2, which is the best ideal pH for pepsin to work. If you were to move pepsin into the oral cavity, it wouldn't work. If you were to move amylase into the stomach, it wouldn't work. So they have their very specific pH that they work at, optimal pH. Those same cells also produce a substance called intrinsic factor, which is a carrier that helps to absorb vitamin B12. And this is very interesting. I want to get into a little clinical stuff. Many people who have problems with reflux or even ulcers, they take drugs that reduce the production of hydrochloric acid, or they act on the parietal cell to reduce that, right? Well, while they're acting on the production of hydrochloric acid, it's also affecting the production of intrinsic factor. When someone stays on these drugs, and then they're called proton pump inhibitors, too long, this can interfere with the absorption of vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is actually very important in maintaining, it helps in maintaining our normal levels of iron and hemoglobin. So someone can actually become anemic if they're on this too long. Next couple cells, one is called the G cell, and this produces a variety of hormones that we'll talk about. And the last substance is mucus. Mucus is produced by couple different cells, what are called, happens to be neck cells. It says, calls them mucus cells, but neck cells that produce mucus. And also up here, we have what are called goblet cells that also produce mucus, much like the goblet cells in the respiratory tract. So we have a lot of stuff that's being produced. All right. Here you can see what's going on, a little bit more detail. Here are these, what they call neck cells. These are, here you can see these parietal cells. Here you can see the chief cells. I don't think it shows the endocrine cells on this picture. Oh well, but they're basically down here. So 4 different types of cells. And here you can get a really nice view of that pit. So this is the lining of the stomach. We have all these little pits. All right. So we've got this gastric mucosa anatomy. This is actually a scanning electron micrograph of the gastric pits. Here's the mucus, a little bit of mucus on top, and here's just another view of them, right? Here's the chief cells, parietal cell, mucus neck cells. What they're referring to as the enteroendocrine cell, that's just another name for the G cell. So getting to the hormones themselves, let's take a look at some of the hormones that are produced. So first of all, to summarize, here's the mucus cells, mucus surface cells, mucus neck cells, parietal cells, chief cells, endocrine cells. The endocrine cells, these cells produce 4 distinct hormones. What I mean by hormones is that what they make is released into the blood, as opposed to here, these 3 cells, parietal, chief, and mucus, secrete their substance directly into the pit, which works its way up to the surface. All right. Okay, so the 4 different hormones are somatostatin, gastrin, ghrelin, and histamine. All right, so right now I'm just going to kind of briefly describe what each of them do, and then we'll get into more later. First of all, somatostatin is a hormone that slows down or inhibits activity of these cells. So it inhibits digestive function. We've talked about homeostasis, kind of regulating things, right? As much as we want to have digestive function occurring, we also, there's times, especially when there's no food in the stomach, in the intestine or it's elsewhere, we don't want the stomach just to be cranking out enzymes. We want to shut it down, and that's somatostatin's job. The counter of that is gastrin and histamine. These are 2, and it's interesting, we've already heard of histamine in terms of its role in allergies and stuff, but in the stomach, it's actually a hormone, much like gastrin, that stimulate hydrochloric acid production. And we'll talk a bit about that shortly. It's kind of a fascinating mechanism. Let's see how we're doing here. All right. So somatostatin inhibits, gastrin and histamine stimulate. Then there's ghrelin, kind of an interesting spelling. It's pronounced ghrelin. This is the hormone that is responsible for initiating the sensation of appetite. So say, for example, if you're used to eating lunch at noon, like now, probably maybe, and you're starting to feel hungry, it's due to this hormone that's traveling up to the brain, which is something that we're going to talk about next time, the whole mechanism of appetite and why we feel full. So ghrelin is released right before our normal eating time, goes to the brain and triggers a response. So we'll talk about. So this is kind of the appetite stimulant, ghrelin. All right. So let's go into a little bit more detail of the specific cell types. I want to first talk about the chief cells. I'm sorry, what are we talking about? Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the parietal cell. Parietal cell, as I mentioned, produces hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid, as I mentioned, is important, right, in lowering the pH, which is ideal for enzyme activity, and also for killing bacteria, right? Well, remember I mentioned that pepsinogen needs to be converted to pepsin. And what triggers it to be converted into pepsin is hydrochloric acid. So the fact that when this enzyme is first released, it's inactive, it's pepsinogen. Only when hydrochloric acid is released, hopefully only when food is present, will pepsinogen be converted into pepsin. And then pepsin can then do its digestion. So you need both of those two. And that's another issue with taking these proton pump inhibitors. There's a concern long-term that people don't digest proteins as well if they're on those drugs very long, because it's affecting the stomach pH. All right. Let's talk a bit about how hydrochloric acid is made. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and then I'm going to show you this interesting little video that explains it. Let me see how we're doing here. Okay, we're good. Sorry about that. All right. All right. So what do we know about hydrochloric acid synthesis? So this is the parietal cell. This is the lumen of the stomach. So this is where the gastric pit is. This is the blood, right? If you take a look just from looking at this picture, you can see that we have carbon dioxide and hydrochloric and water. And of course, all cells, due to metabolism, right, they generate carbon dioxide and water. Well, in this case, carbon dioxide and water in the presence of carbonic anhydrase, which is Ca, is converted into carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is dissociated into hydrogen and bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is pumped out of the cell into the blood in exchange for chloride. This is often referred to as a chloride shift. So hydrogen's already in the cell. Hydrogen then gets pumped from the cell into the lumen by what's called this hydrogen potassium ATPase, which is otherwise known as a proton pump. This is the proton pump that they were talking about in that video that pumps hydrogen into the lumen. What about the chloride that was brought in through the blood? The chloride leaves the cell into the lumen by way of facilitated diffusion. Remember, like high concentrate, this is through ion channels. All right, so let me just put this video on. Now in the video, they're going to talk about a couple things. The role of gastrin in stimulating hydrochloric acid production. They're going to talk about histamine. And they're also going to talk about acetylcholine. And that role, the acetylcholine, remember, is the neurotransmitter for the parasympathetic system. And the parasympathetic system, if you remember, stimulates digestion. So let's take a look at this. Let's see if I can get this going here. Let's see. Let me go here. I like the music. Let's see. And then.
In order to protect the cell from the damaging acidity of hydrochloric acid, the parietal cell has to produce the components of hydrochloric acid separately. Histamine, gastrin, and acetylcholine will bind to receptors on the parietal cell. This initiates the hydrochloric acid production process. All three chemicals have to bind to the cell in order for this process to occur. Otherwise, hydrochloric acid production won't happen. Carbon dioxide diffuses into the cell, and the enzyme carbonic anhydrase catalyzes the reaction between carbon dioxide and water to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. As bicarbonate ion accumulates into the cell, bicarbonate ion is ejected through the basal cell membrane into the capillary blood. As a result, blood draining from the stomach is more alkaline than the blood serving it. This is known as the alkaline tide. The bicarbonate chloride antiporter in the plasma membrane exchanges bicarbonate molecules going out for chloride ions coming in. This is known as a chloride shift. ATP will bind to the hydrogen potassium ATPase, where the potassium ions are counter-transferred to the parietal cell in exchange for hydrogen ions. Chloride is simply diffused through the cell membrane and enter the gastric gland. In the gastric gland,
chloride ions will combine with hydrogen ions to form hydrochloric acid, which will then be secreted into the stomach.
All right, there you go. With a little jazz music in there to go with it. Okay. All right, let's stop share. And let's see, let me go back to share screen. And here we go. Okay. All right, moving along. Okay, so this is kind of a summary of what you just saw. Move this down a bit, there we go. Hydrogen ions are formed from the dissociation of water molecules, basically carbon dioxide and water in the presence of carbonic anhydrase form carbonic acid, which dissociates into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen. As I mentioned, bicarbonate is exchanged for chloride ion due to the what they call the chloride shift. Hydrogen ions are pumped out of the cell in exchange for potassium, known as the hydrogen potassium ATPase. Now, this term canaliculi, I haven't mentioned that yet. There's a very unique structure inside these cells that protects them from any effects of hydrogen. It's called a canaliculi. It's a little transport pathway. And that's how hydrogen actually leaves the cell, through these canaliculi, whereas chloride travels through a different path. All right. Okay, so a little summary, but also more information. So when we talk about the regulation of hydrochloric acid production, it's inhibited by somatostatin. Don't worry about that term where it says D cells. They used to have subdivisions of endocrine cells based on what hormone produced, what was produced. Just know it as an endocrine cell, or a G cell is fine. So HCl is inhibited by somatostatin. It's stimulated by gastrin. It's stimulated by histamine, as you know, and also acetylcholine by way of the parasympathetic system, that vagus nerve. So three things, and all three of those are required to maximize hydrochloric acid production. If one is absent, that will severely impair it. And for example, histamine. So there's different types of receptors for histamine. One is the one in the gut is called H2. The one that you use to treat allergies, like antihistamines, block H1 receptors. So some of the drugs that are used to treat GERD are actually antihistamines. They block H2 receptors in the stomach, which block histamine production, and as a result will inhibit hydrochloric acid production. An example of that would be something like Zantac. That's actually an antihistamine. Drugs that block the hydrogen pump, right, that proton pump, would be something like Prilosec. Those are called proton pump inhibitors. So a couple different ways people use to inhibit or reduce hydrochloric acid production for things like GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. All right. So I want to talk about a few more types of pathologies and get into some really cool treatments for them. I'm not going to get into all of them, but just a couple. Well, first of all, the primary one I want to mention is peptic ulcers. These are sores or lesions in the stomach, which would be the gastric, or even further down in the duodenal mucosa. We haven't spoken about the intestine yet, but I'd kind of link this together. That can be these are sores or very serious lesions in the mucosa that can be caused by either a tumor, which is known as the Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. This is a type of tumor that, and you know, tumors, of course, act on stimulating like proliferation of cells, increase their activity. Well, in the case of this, it triggers the production or proliferation of endocrine cells in the gut, and they start squirting out more and more gastrin all the time. Now, we don't want gastrin all the time, right? We want gastrin only produced when there's hydrochloric acid in the stomach. I'm sorry, we only want gastrin being produced which is stimulating acid production when there's food in the stomach, right? When there's no food in the stomach, we don't want any gastrin, thereby no hydrochloric acid. These are tumors that are squirting out acid all the time, cause of ulcers. The other one, which I want to talk about, is Helicobacter pylori. This is this bacteria, it's also known as H. pylori, that I put down may cause ulcers, but I'm probably going to change that to does cause ulcers. Not every type of ulcer, not all the time, but it's pretty significant. And this was discovered by some scientists in Australia. You don't have to know the story. Some of you guys may already know it. That they had some patients coming in that had bacterial infections, and doctors were giving them antibiotics for bacterial infections, and the patients were coming in saying, you know what, I've been having stomach problems ever since you gave me the antibiotics. My stomach problems are better. So it's like, is this just a coincidence or what? And this happened over and over and over again. So doctors figured, well, let's go ahead and swab these people's stomachs. So they put a little catheter down, tiny sample of tissue, put it in a petri dish, grew up, they found bacteria. Just because you've got all this bacteria doesn't mean that it's causing stomach problems or ulcers or anything, right? It's cause and effect. I mean, it could just be there, maybe helpful bacteria like there is in the intestine. So the doctors tried a little experiment that eventually earned them a Nobel Prize, as they prepared a little cocktail of H. pylori and drank it themselves. They each gave themselves ulcers. And then they treated themselves with antibiotics and it got better. So that earned them the Nobel Prize. Couple scientists in Australia. One's name is Marshall. Last name is Marshall. I can't think of the other one's name. You guys can look this up if you want. So it's kind of an interesting story. The other thing I want to show you is this video. And this is a diagnostic video showing ways of how doctors can scan the digestive tract. And you've heard of things like endoscopy, right? Colonoscopy, sigmoidoscopy, right? But they're good, but they can't see actually down into the stomach per se. They can see into the esophagus, but they can't necessarily see in the stomach. Well, there's a substance called PillCam, which was developed by scientists. The company, I think, is called Gavin Pharmaceuticals. This PillCam looks like a pill, contains a camera inside it. And the patient who needs to be looked at swallows the pill as it's going down and takes pictures. So enough of me talking. Let me just show you this video. Let's see. Hold on one second. Let me just back. Hold on one second. Let me start over. Let me stop for a second. Okay, let me start that over again.
The PillCam ESO video capsule is specifically designed to view the inner lining of the esophagus. Once swallowed, the PillCam ESO travels through the esophagus by normal peristaltic wave, flashing 14 times per second, each time capturing images of the inner lining of the esophagus to identify potential abnormalities, such as esophagitis, the inflammation of the lining of the esophagus usually caused by GERD, or symptoms of Barrett's esophagus, abnormal cell growth in the lower esophagus that can lead to a cancerous condition. As the images are captured, they are transmitted to the sensors located on the patient's chest. These images then travel from the sensors along the wires to the data recorder, worn on a belt around the patient's waist for later reading by a physician.
All right, so let's see. So just to kind of elaborate, that was an example of a pill that's specifically looking at the esophagus. There are other PillCams that are modified that they actually continue on into the stomach. This particular one is inactivated in the stomach. And of course, ultimately the fate of the pill, it ends up obviously being eliminated through the waste, right? So that's another example of a disposable camera, I guess you can call it. All right. And let's see. All right. Couple more slides to mention. I want to talk a little bit about H. pylori, why it's able to survive in the gut under those extreme acidic conditions, is that it's able to convert, first of all, it produces ammonia. Ammonia, if you remember maybe from chemistry, ammonia is a base. Where does ammonia come from? It takes urea, which is actually a breakdown of proteins. It's a nitrogenous waste product of proteins that ends up in the urine in many cases, but there's also some in the gut. That urea is broken down into carbon dioxide and ammonia. And the ammonia creates a kind of a protective bubble around the bacteria. And as a result, it's buffered from being damaged by hydrochloric acid. And it depends on the production of an enzyme called urease. Urease converts urea into the carbon dioxide and the ammonia. Pretty cool stuff. All right, okay. Last slide I want to mention, and this has to do with why normally we don't, if you think of all this acid in the stomach, why we don't just digest our stomach, right? Well, several different reasons. Number one is, first of all, parietal cells, which release hydrochloric acid, and Chief cells, they're impermeable to hydrochloric acid coming into their cells. So there's a barrier that prevents them from going back in. Beyond that, the mucus that are produced by those mucus cells and goblet cells is very alkaline. So it helps to buffer the hydrochloric acid that's in the stomach. All right. I'm going to skip down for a second. Another one is if there are any damaged cells which can become permeable and hydrochloric acid can go in, those cells are rapidly replaced. So epithelial cells of the stomach have a very high turnover rate, a lot of mitosis going on that constantly replaces cells. Because if you think about it, these cells are constantly exposed to food, enzymes, stuff like that. So they get worn down a bit. So we don't they're eventually phagocytized, removed, replaced, and we have new cells. One of the things I wanted to mention, interestingly, is the production of prostaglandins. Actually, where are we here? Okay, so mucus, the mucus that are produced by those mucus cells depends on being stimulated by hormones called prostaglandins. Much like hydrochloric acid is dependent upon gastrin and histamine and acetylcholine as stimulators of it, the production of mucus is exacerbated or increased by prostaglandins. Where do prostaglandins come from? Well, you might remember from the clotting mechanism we spoke about, like prostacyclines, thromboxanes, those are types of prostaglandins. Well, these prostaglandins, all right, and they're formed by an enzyme called COX-1. These prostaglandins stimulate mucus production. So what am I trying to say here before kind of going in circles? Is prostaglandins are chemicals in the gut that stimulate the production of mucus. So the more prostaglandins you have, the more mucus you have being produced, which is what you want. You want the prostaglandins to be stimulating mucus production. One of the potential problems that can occur is COX-1 is an enzyme that's also targeted by non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, things like aspirin and ibuprofen, right? They target COX-1 and COX-2, which is an enzyme that's produced somewhere else. We won't worry about that right now. But aspirin and ibuprofen target COX-1. Well, prostaglandins in other parts of the body is responsible for triggering pain. I know this is very, very complex. Prostaglandins are produced all over the place. in certain areas of the body, like the nerve endings, prostaglandins sensitize us to pain. So it makes sense if you take a drug like aspirin or ibuprofen, one of the targets can be the enzyme that's making that prostaglandin, and that's how we get the reduction of pain via inhibiting the enzyme. That same drug also targets the enzyme in the stomach, COX-1, that's making prostaglandins and stimulating mucus. So make a long story longer, what happens is when you take those drugs, in some people especially, it stops the mucus production, which makes people very vulnerable to ulcers possibly, or at least irritation in the stomach. You may be one of those people, or you may know of some people that can't take aspirin or they can't take ibuprofen because it irritates the stomach. And that's because that aspirin is blocking the prostaglandins, which are normally stimulating mucus production. So sorry for that long-winded talk, but hopefully you guys got it. All right. So I'm going to stop there. That takes us to the end of the stomach. It looks like almost everyone's here. That's good. So the plan for today is I am going to have office hours from 3 to 4 if you have any questions about today's lecture or anything else. Thursday, we're going to finish up digestion and also review. I'll probably send you guys out a study guide tomorrow, and the exam is on the 28th, it looks like. This lecture was recorded as well. So while we're here, it looks like almost everybody is muted except for a few people, maybe like Simon and a few others. Anyone has any questions? Let me take a look at the Zoom chat. No, nothing there. If anyone has any questions, you can ask me now. I'll wait a little bit. Or if you want to come stop by at 3, a couple hours from now, we can chat again. So any questions? All right. Well, I will end this now, and I'll see you guys for sure on Thursday. All right. Have a great day.